In this video, I'm going to go through exactly how you can become fluent in Spanish faster, but also with less effort. And this is the same thing that I used when I was in the process of becoming fluent in Spanish as well. By the way, if you don't know who I am, my name's Jonathan. I started learning Spanish back in February 2021 through immersion and comprehensible input. I set myself the goal that I wanted to become fluent in 8 months by November, because that's when my birthday is. And I wanted to do a trip to Spain and speak to people in Spanish, which I eventually did. So I documented it on my Instagram as well. So I went to Madrid, I went to Barcelona. Great time, by the way. Met a lot of people, had a lot of good memories, good experiences. And then since then, I've done a few interviews in Spanish, just explaining the process that I went through. So this is the interview I did with Mike Ben, and this is also the interview I did with Pablo from Dream in Spanish. Big shout out to those guys. But what I wanted to do today, guys, was talk about the concept of the 80-20 rule and how this can specifically be applied to learning Spanish. Now, I want to give credit from the start as well. The idea from this video, I got it from three people actually. The first person was someone that you might actually recognize, someone called Luca Lampiarello. Sorry, apologies. I apologize for pronouncing the name correctly. But yeah, he's a famous polyglot, really good in the language learning space. I watched a lot of his videos, really helpful. Also, he did this Q&A. So he did this Q&A with David, who's also called Lingua Thought. Also does some great videos. So big shout out to those guys. But I was watching this Q&A that they did, and it was a really good Q&A. I'm going to leave the description. I'm going to leave the link in the description below so you can watch it as well. But they went for a few concepts in the video that I thought was really interesting surrounding the 80-20 rule and input versus output. Now, the reason why in particular, I was like, yeah, this is great. Maybe I should even make a video talking about this as well, specifically for learning Spanish, is because of someone called Alex Hormozy, who's the third person I want to give credit to. Now, Alex doesn't do language learning videos, but he talks about this concept of how we as humans, we need to be reminded rather than we need to be taught. And when I was watching this Q&A from Luca and David, I realized, okay, what they're talking about isn't something that I don't necessarily know, but they've reminded me in a way that I can now apply and get better results for the effort that I'm putting into my language learning. Okay. And I realized that this is what I was doing back in 2021 when I was learning Spanish in the first place. And sometimes you're doing something and maybe you either forget that you did it or you lose the emphasis that you originally had. And sometimes someone needs to remind you of, oh yeah, this is what you were doing. This is where the results were coming from, which gets you back on track. And that's what that Q&A did. So great Q&A. But they were talking about the 80-20 rule. And the way they were talking about it in particular was in regards to, okay, how do we balance receiving input and outputting? And if you don't know what that means, receiving input is any times that we're consuming content, whether that's written, most times it's going to be some sort of auditory and visual content, like a series or maybe a movie, or maybe reading like a book in Spanish, versus us trying to speak or write in Spanish, mainly speaking, but that would be output. And they really wanted to emphasize the fact that, okay, when we're learning Spanish, well, they were talking about languages in general, but we're going to talk about Spanish here. The key is we need to have at least 80% of our time being dedicated towards input. Now, why is that the case? Why is it 80-20? Well, the idea is that, and this is the whole 80-20 rule, the idea is that, 80% of your results is going to come from 20% of the task that you're doing. That's even one way that I've heard the 80-20 rule being explained. Another way is that, listen, you just spend 80% of your time on the task that produces the most results or has the most leverage. And then you spend 20% of your time doing everything else. And in this case, the argument is that input is what's going to produce the most results. And the reason why is because it's through input that you build up a base. You build up almost like a reserve, like a bank account of subconscious knowledge, which is specifically what we need when it comes to speaking to natives in Spanish or understanding natives when they speak in Spanish in real time. And the reason why that even makes sense is because at its foundation, learning Spanish is just about building a relationship with Spanish, like a personal relationship with Spanish. The more input you receive, the more time you spend with Spanish in Spanish's natural context, and their natural habitat. Their natural context. what will happen is you'll start to develop an innate understanding of, okay, this is what Spanish sounds like, this is what Spanish says, this is what Spanish doesn't say in this specific context, the same way you would with a friend. And that is what helps you to be able to reproduce the language when you need to. Now, in the video, in the Q&A, David actually used an analogy which was really good. And he talked about, you know how you receive input sometimes of like a song. Let's say you always go to the gym, and this happens to me in the gym because there's certain songs in the gym that always come on again and again and again. And I've never looked up the song. I don't even know what they're called. But just from receiving so much input of that song, I now know how it sounds. Like I can sing along with the song. I know the words of the song, at least to a good extent. And I've never even researched the song. The same thing can happen with input, whereby just like a song, if you receive enough input, you'll start to hear how the language is supposed to sound, and you'll start to know, okay, what the language says, even without necessarily researching it. Now, obviously, there is a time and a place to sit down, study, research, look up things in Spanish, understand concepts. I'm not neglecting that completely. However, what I realized, or what I've been reminded through this Q&A, is the fact that actually it is the input that forms as a foundation for everything else. And so the input is what makes the study more effective. It's the input that makes the grammatical study more useful. It's the input, the baseline of the input, that makes you now doing your Anki deck, whatever it is, more useful, because the baseline has already been set. And then once you understand that, which is point number one, number two is then just asking, okay, great, how do I optimize my input sessions? Like, what can I do when it comes to receiving input that will be more effective? And I actually believe you can add the 80-20 inside of the receiving input. So you're spending 80% of your time receiving input, and then you can actually break down that 80% of time into the 80-20 as well. What do I mean? Well, when it comes to receiving input, typically what you'll find is that the typical dilemma that language learners face, specifically language learners, but also when you're learning Spanish, is that we have to balance between input that is comprehensible and input that is enjoyable. What do I mean? Well, typically when we're watching some sort of content or receiving some sort of input in Spanish, we are doing so based on the concept of comprehensible input. And basically the idea, or most people would agree, or most people get behind the idea, that the higher the percentage of the content that you're receiving input from, the higher percentage that you can understand of that content, the faster you're going to be able to acquire the remaining vocabulary, grammatical structures, or adjectives that you haven't quite yet acquired, because you understand the context surrounding what you don't know. So it's almost like if you're watching, let me think of a good example. If you are in a football team and you know everybody in the football team, and all of a sudden an outsider of the football team comes into the football team, you're like, okay, great, I don't know this guy, but I can guess based on the context of why the person here and the time that the person's here, I can guess that, okay, he's looking to train with us and join the football team. It's kind of the same, as a weird example, but it's kind of the same with language learning, whereby you might know all of the words surrounding a specific word, and based on the context and where the person that word has appeared, kind of like in the example of the football trainer, you can say, okay, I can kind of guess that, okay, that word means this, because I understand the context. If I didn't understand the context, then it'll be harder for me to make that assumption. So the idea is that we, in theory, want to prioritize content that is more comprehensible. What's the challenge? Well, the challenge is that a lot of the times, or at least once you get to the slight more, let's say, advanced beginner, intermediate level, you'll find that the content that is more comprehensible might become less enjoyable. And because it's less enjoyable, it's harder to spend a longer period of time watching or receiving that type of input. And so the flip argument is actually, no, let's focus on content that is enjoyable. Because if we focus on content that's enjoyable, we'll be able to spend more time with Spanish. And with time, even though maybe we don't understand as much, we will start to get more exposure to these same contexts over and over again. And that will help us to learn and acquire these vocabs anyway, even though it's less comprehension. And I do actually tend towards that argument just because of the practicality of understanding, okay, if we want to do this, we need to create a personal relationship with Spanish, which takes time, which takes hours, and we need to do so consistently. Now, if we want to do so consistently, we want to reduce friction. And reducing friction, one of the ways to reduce friction is to increase enjoyment. If I can enjoy doing something, if I can easily frame something in my mind as a task that I'm enjoying and something that I actually genuinely like doing, rather than something that I have to do, then it just means I'm more likely to carry out that task on a consistent basis over time. So I do lean towards, okay, focus on enjoyment. However, if we apply the 80/20, we could say, okay, why don't we just say we focus maybe around 80% of our time on the enjoyment side and we focus the remaining 20% on the comprehension side? Meaning, okay, why don't we say, okay, if we have an hour a day of input, we can say, I don't know, like 80% of that hour, which is like 80% of 60 minutes. I'm not sure what the exact maths would be, or so be somewhere around 40, like 48, 50 minutes of enjoyment, around about that. Could be less, could be more, but the idea is that we're trying to optimize the time. And we're saying, okay, around about 80% of the time I could focus on enjoyment, about 10% of the time I could focus on comprehension. Now, you could do more than that, and you might even find that, okay, depending on the level that you're at, for example, when I was a beginner, when I was a really like early beginner, just watching content in Spanish was enjoyable for me. And I was focusing on comprehension. I was focusing on trying to find simple content, but because of the level I was at, it was enjoyable for me anyway. And that's a great period to be in. So it doesn't have to be exact, but the point is we're understanding how we can optimize our time. And what this is going to help us to do, spend more time with Spanish, absorb more of the information, acquire more of the language, and actually use less effort. Because what we're doing is we're trying to optimize, number one, for the thing that's most effective, but also the thing that's easier to do over a long period of time. Okay. And what we can even do, which is the third point, to make it more likely for us to do this over a long period of time, is we can create a system or a schedule or a routine which encourages us to do this consistently. Okay. Now, the easiest way to do this, if you haven't already, is to create a calendar. Use Google Calendar as the easiest one to use. And just schedule in a time that's more or less the same time every day. So let's say from Monday to Sunday, around 4 to 5 p.m. is the time that you're typically most free. Just put in a block, 4 to 5 p.m. Spanish. If it's 5 to 6 p.m., put 5 to 6 p.m., put it in the block, put it in the calendar. Just by putting it in the calendar, you're more likely to do it. It's a sign of accountability, but it also means that in a weird kind of internal body clock way, your mind starts to become used to the fact that, okay, at this time every single day, this is when I do my Spanish, rather than making it ad hoc. Now, especially if you're a busy person, especially if you're someone that has other things to do, you have a job, maybe you have kids, maybe you have other responsibilities, maybe you have a business, maybe you have sports, maybe you play instruments. If you have a specific time that you do Spanish, what will happen is you'll have less friction, along with the fact that, okay, we're focusing on input, along with the fact that we're focusing on making it more enjoyable. If we have a specific time, then it's going to mean that there's less friction to complete it, and you're going to complete it with more consistency over time, which is all we want. That's all we want. We want to complete it with more consistency, and we want to focus on the thing that's going to give us more output for our input, which is leverage. Okay. Now, if you're even looking for, okay, what's the best way for me to even decide how much time I should spend on this, I recommend, and this is something that I've created called the 60/60 routine, or 60/60 challenge. Just spend 60 minutes per day for 60 straight days. If you can do that, what you're going to establish is consistency. And once you've established consistency when it comes to learning Spanish, then you can add complexity. Then you can either add complexity, or you can add intensity, meaning you can make the task more complex. You can add more different exercises. Anki, you can add Anki, you can do shadowing, you can do some different types of crosstalks, you can do even some exercises if you want to, you can do some speaking, like different speaking challenges with yourself. All of that complexity can come. Or even intensity, you can do it for 100 minutes, you can do it for 2 hours, you can do it for 3 hours, you can do it for 4 hours a day, completely up to yourself. But if you start with the consistency, then adding those things on becomes easier. And also, once you do add more complexity, the foundation of the consistency surrounding input is what's going to make the additional tasks, like the Ankis and all of those things, more effective for you. Right? Because what happens is the baseline has already been built. The baseline of consistent, solid input has been built. And so now when you're building the house on top, it has a structure to stand on. And what this does is, over time, it means that when you're trying to learn Spanish and trying to reach fluency, you can do so faster than what you would if you didn't have this base in place. Now, again, the truth is, when it comes to becoming fluent in a language, it takes time, and it doesn't really mean, like, fluency is something that's always moving. It's a moving target. Once you get to the point where you're like conversationally fluent, or whatever it is, you realize that, okay, there's more that I need to learn, and you want to go to the next level, which is great. That's how it's supposed to be. But the point is, when it comes to learning Spanish, there are things that you can do to help yourself to, number one, progress faster, but two, make language learning or make learning Spanish more sustainable so that you don't quit too soon, which happens to a lot of people. They just quit too soon because they haven't optimized their routine and they haven't created a system that allows them to stay in the game. And one of the biggest things you want to do when it comes to learning Spanish today is do so in a way that will allow you to continue learning Spanish tomorrow. Okay. Now, if you want my personal help to do that, if you want me to help you to set up your own daily routine, if you want to be part of a private group with myself where we can hold each other accountable when it comes to learning Spanish, if you click on the first link in the description, you'll have a link to our community, and I'll see you in the next video.